All right, people. I'm very excited to drop this new episode with Cadell Last, since I think he is one of the most interesting young scholars and budding philosophers to pop out of Canada in some time. As you're about to hear, Cadell completed his MSc at the University of Toronto in evolutionary anthropology before moving to Brussels to complete his PhD in philosophy, which culminated in the publication of his thesis in book form as The Global Brain Singularity, Universal History, Future Evolution, and Humanity's Dialectical Horizon. That said, Cadell and I had a vast and sweeping conversation over the scope of his work. My goal in this conversation was to tease out of Cadell his genius ability for speculative thinking and intuitively lean into new philosophical horizons, since I saw many parallels in his work to Richard J. Bernstein along various themes, who, by the way, is one of my favorite philosophers. So buckle up and enjoy the ride, and I hope you all enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Cheers. Been looking forward to actually connecting with you for quite some time. I've been an admirer of your work at a distance. And since having my conversation with Daniel Tutt, I said I should reach out now and try to strike while the iron is hot, since I feel it would be a good follow-up conversation here to some of the stuff that I've been doing on my pod. And I gotta say, I mean, before we actually kind of get into it, I mean, I'm super impressed with your productivity. If I understand correctly, you got your PhD in 2019 and you already got 5 books in the pipe that you've published, essentially.
Okay. No, that's true. No, it's true. So in 2019, I finished my doctorate. I think I defended in March. Yeah, no, I defended in 2019. That's right. And I've got my doctoral thesis. I've got systems and subjects, which I wrote for my postdoc. I have a co-authored book, which was a trialogue with 2 friends, Daniel Dick and Kevin Oros, on sex, masculinity, and God, as well as 2 anthologies in which I have several articles, but which is really my job is there to also edit and oversee the development of other people's work as well.
Cool. No, I mean, I've just been impressed with your output, and along with your YouTube channel and all the stuff that you've been doing online. I know how much work this is. So, I mean, hats off to you. The other thing too that I've been really impressed with, and I'm excited to talk to you about, is essentially just the mix of people that you've had on your podcast, and the people that are coming from various backgrounds and traditions and philosophical orientations. Which I'm kind of excited to actually go out and get into a bit, because my background is kind of like Layman Pascal, and I kind of fell out of the integral diaspora at one point or another before actually going back to university and actually specializing in religious studies, which is a bit of an interest of yours as well, in terms of some of the stuff that you've been doing in terms of spiritual leadership. And I know you're quite open to ideas of religion, so I'm interested to get into that. But before diving in, I mean, I want to play up your background a bit. I mean, as a fellow Canadian, yeah, I mean, just tell me a bit, in terms of how you grew up. I mean, if I understand, you grew up in Ontario before moving on and eventually going through all your academic studies and landing up in Europe. I'd love to hear just a bit about that before we get into your books and stuff.
Oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, so I'm a fellow Canadian, born and raised in Hamilton, Ontario. Spent basically my entire childhood and teenage years in Hamilton. Did my original. I actually failed high school, mostly because I was just focused on sports, and I really love sports.
Baseball, if I understand, mostly.
Yeah, baseball. I also played basketball and football, but I wasn't really aiming to go pro in those sports. But I had my sights set on baseball for that, for sure.
Oh, cool. Okay, because I'm a fellow football player as well. I played Sage up in the area of Montreal and stuff like that. So nice.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah. So football was I think a blessing that I didn't try to go too deep into football. Like I played 2 seasons, but also developed a knee injury and I think that saved me from perhaps even more damage if I continued in that direction. Baseball, you can I did break my thumb one game by getting hit by a pitch, but you can the injuries aren't as intense in
Oh,
baseball, so
no, no.
that's
Well, I mean, I could share about some stories there too. I mean, three broken collarbones on my side, and I broken tibia and fibula as well in terms of my leg. So it wasn't my knee,
it's
thankfully. So
tough.
it's a brutal sport, but it's a lot of fun. I mean, it's the camaraderie and the team
Yeah.
aspect of football is something that I just really enjoy. Cool, cool. Yeah, yeah. But keep going in terms of, so you carried that into
Yeah.
university.
So, well, I went to college at a Mohawk College in Hamilton, and I was just doing that as a bridge to sort of figure out what I was interested in. I found myself in a general arts and science program, which sort of exposed me to everything. Um, and I remember really taking to some professors and some subjects, which had a big influence on me. I remember really being, really interested in psychology, sociology, history, politics. But I was really the most taken by anthropology and human evolution. And so that's where I started to develop my master's. Sorry, my majors in a university when I eventually transitioned into university. And that took up about 6 years of my life. Both undergrad and my master's was in evolutionary anthropology. I was interested in the connection between chimpanzees and humans behaviorally, technologically, culturally. I actually did two primate field surveys in Cameroon, studying chimpanzees and gorillas in Cameroon. Actually, it was quite an adventure because we were in territories which were mostly with unhabituated populations. So for that just means populations of chimps and gorillas which have very little contact with humans and mostly an aggressive and violent relationship with humans due to hunting, due to different territorial disputes, even with local people. So that was quite an adventure. Um, and I found myself in my master's basically increasingly dealing with institutional bureaucratic machinery which was taking me away from my desire, was taking me away from what I really wanted to be studying and doing. Basically, I was having to make a series of compromises with the institutional with supervisors and bureaucratic machinery to continue in that direction. And so I basically pulled out of that direction. And on the side in the evenings, while I was interested in evolutionary anthropology and that was genuine, I was also interested in the technological singularity, but I didn't find an institutional support for that interest.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, I developed blogs about it and developed a little cartoon about it and things like that. And in my year off from my master's, I was looking for potential doctoral programs where I could continue in that direction and sort of take the evolutionary anthropological interest and combine it with more of a futurist orientation, a more interdisciplinary orientation. And so happens I found it in Brussels at a program that was at the time called the Global Brain Institute, which had funding. They had just gotten funding for 4 or 5 years, and they were looking for doctoral students that I fit the description. So I was able to get a grant for 4 years, and that 4 years ended up becoming Global Brain Singularity, which is my doctoral thesis. And Global Brain Singularity is basically trying to combine evolutionary thinking, which is centered on the human being,
Mm-hmm.
with some of the more speculative edges of futurist science and technological progress, and trying to create some sort of synergy or interconnection between these ways of thinking.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. And I mean, in terms of your MSc, you did that at the University of Toronto, essentially. I mean, which is a
That's right.
really, it's a huge university. I mean, in terms of, I mean, I'm from Montreal. I went to Concordia, and I mean, a few times I've been to Toronto and just kind of visited campus around there and stuff like that. It is a massive bureaucratic type of machine. So,
That's right. And so that's basically what I was describing there. In the transition from McMaster to University of Toronto, I did want to get in because it was a prestigious university, but yeah, it was just too many compromises, too many concessions.
Gotcha. And I mean, at U of T, I mean, because I mean, there's a lot of people who are around U of T, and even some people that are kind of bouncing around some of the circles that we're in and you're in specifically. And Ontario in general is, I mean, it's been a real hub for some of the work that you've been doing in terms of collaborators and stuff like that back and forth. I think if I understand correctly, I think Layman is in Ontario somewhere. Layman Pascal.
Yep, that's right. Layman Pascal's in Ontario. If I'm not mistaken, I think he's closer to Thunder Bay in the north.
Okay.
Well, relatively north.
Yeah. But I mean, there's been interesting developments out of the U of T. I mean, obviously,
Yep,
guys like John Vervaeke and obviously
yeah.
Jordan Peterson that you've also written on quite a bit there as well, which is pretty funny in terms of well, an interesting character. And I've actually really appreciated some of the writing that you've done on Zizek and Peterson as well there too. Okay, cool. And at once you landed up in Europe specifically, I mean, who have you been studying with? I guess in terms of the system science type stuff and people that have had a real impact on you.
Yeah, so I mean, when I went to Brussels, my supervisor's background was in cybernetics.
Okay.
His name's Francis Heiligen. I highly recommend his work. He's a world-renowned researcher. He's a pioneer in the study of self-organization. I would say he's a pioneer also in the concept of the global brain, the idea that the internet should be or could be metaphorically understood as a type of nervous system, a type of brain structure. And it's sort of like interactions on the internet are sort of analogous to interactions between neurons in the brain, and that we're forming a type of global brain, forming a type of global consciousness, and that's something that he's written about extensively. And of course, as my supervisor, he influenced me a lot in terms of my research direction, and in terms of the papers I was reading and the connections I was making. You know, I read a lot of course, Ray Kurzweil, but also guys like Ben Goertzel, who's a researcher in artificial general intelligence and also thinking in terms of a global brain. So I was interested in basically ideas of the technological singularity, which were more informed by systemics, which were more informed by cybernetics. And I continued to find links there between those fields and anthropology.
Hmm.
But I also, throughout my studies, developed with some colleagues a program which is still operative at the Free University of Brussels called the School of Thinking. And we wanted at the School of Thinking to basically create a place where the object of the discipline was thought itself. And through that development, I made a connection with the Bertalanffy Center for System Science, and that's based in Vienna, and that's where I basically did my postdoc.
Hmm.
And at the Bertalanffy Center for System Science, of course, I was doing research on the work of Ludwig von Bertalanffy, who's the founder of system science, and his work on the general systems theory has had an influence on me as well, and that was the underpinnings of the second book, which was Systems and Subjects. And my aim there is to really connect everything I had developed in my interdisciplinary studies, broadly speaking, with my growing interest in continental philosophy, because I felt like there was a big discursive opportunity and channel of communication there that needed to be opened. And so that book attempts to do that, basically.
Yeah, and then that, I mean, that's exactly what I love about your work. I mean, is the evolutionary approach and systems theory type approach that you're taking, along with continental philosophy. I mean, it just speaks to me a bit in terms of my own personal background, in terms of stuff around integral theory before I actually went back to university. And then once I rolled into religious studies, I was kind of like you. I mean, kind of looking for that broad sort of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary type based approach. And I wasn't finding it anywhere. I was just faced with the constant, you know, postmodern, deconstructive, or colonial, post-colonial type theory-based approaches to the study of religion and history and that type of stuff. Which I, obviously, I mean, I learned a tremendous amount throughout that and all that, but kind of like you just kind of left a bit wanting and desiring more and wanting to go out and try and reach for something more integrative, or I'm sort of kind of meta horizon or meta science based approach that you've been talking about in terms of your work and stuff like that, which speaks to me on just so many levels. I got slammed with Habermas though, and I'm a bit surprised, I guess, kind of like two of my professors were like specialists in Habermas, and it was actually a good way for me to just kind of weed myself or kind of move away from the integral movement and move into a sort of larger sort of philosophy and deal with a real sort of philosopher in his own right and stuff like that. And I was a bit surprised, I guess, in terms of why. Well, I'm curious to know why you gravitated towards Zizek instead of somebody that would sort of have a more sort of systems based approach, or more similar, I guess, to some of the stuff that you've been doing in systems theory and stuff like that. And why you wouldn't gravitate towards somebody like Habermas versus like Zizek, I guess.
Yeah, great question. And, you know, actually, my supervisor during my doctorate, when I started to get into Zizek, was kind of resistant to the idea precisely because he saw Zizek as very confusing,
Okay.
unsystematic, writing big long texts which would take years to decipher or understand, or without even the guarantee that there is anything to find there. Of course, one does have the popular representation of Zizek as an unsystematic thinker.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely the case. However, having given Zizek so much of my time and so much of my energy in terms of trying to understand his thinking, the original motivation there was sort of a recognition in a cognitive place on my part, which was very open to learning something new, I should say, where I saw that Zizek was thinking in a way that was foreign to me, which was alien to me. I was getting little nuggets of gold from listening to him, from reading him, but I didn't know how he was thinking the way he was thinking. And this intrigued me tremendously. So basically what I'm saying is that there was a style of Zizek's thought which perplexed me and intrigued me at the same time. And after having given so much of my time to studying Zizek, I would say that there is a system at work in Zizek's thought. And that system is very simple. It's the collision between two thinkers. It's the collision between Hegel and German idealism and Lacan and Freudo-Lacanian psychoanalysis. And it's the combination of these two fields which situate all of Zizek's work. And so Zizek's doing something very precise and actually very something systemic. And why it's systemic is because, one, Hegel's thinking is a form of dialectical thought. So there's a mechanics of thought there, a way of thinking there, which I think is quite helpful to keep your thought moving while at the same time rigorous. And then with psychoanalytic thought, there's a method of free association, which brings us very close to the nature of the subject, and I think in a way that both allows the subject its proper room for speech, and at the same time recognizing a structure of language within which the subject is speaking, and in some sense, subordinate to. And so my final point there would be, in regards to Lacan, would be the persistent and commitment to structuralist thinking, which is different than, I don't think that fits. I don't think either the emphasis on dialectics of intersubjectivity and the structure of language and social historical processes is something that can be easily reduced to the post-colonial, postmodern emphasis, which would be post-structuralist, and which is often non-dialectical. So I guess where I saw Zizek is yes, operating in adjacent spaces to the postmodern, post-colonial, post-structuralist work. But he's actually a glitch in that system because he's bringing back dialectical thought. He's bringing back structural linguistics. He's bringing back something which I think was thrown out too quickly.
Gotcha.
So I think that's the importance there.
Yeah, no, and I mean, this is what I love about what you're doing. Well, because I had Matt Fliffesser on as well, and I was really interested in terms of his ideas around a new structuralism and a new humanism that he was trying to go out and articulate. And it just speaks to me very much in the same sort of vein in terms of your work, in terms of moving towards this new horizon or some type of new meta horizon. And him as well, right? I mean, he's a big Zizekian sort of scholar. He comes from that whole background, and I was always curious as well, since he's a communication theorist and professor and stuff like that. Like, why hasn't he get into more Habermas? And he was familiar with it, but kind of like you, I mean, he said that there's something about Zizek's body of work that is just sort of speaking, or was speaking to him on multiple levels, and I just finding it interesting in terms of, well, I guess kind of like, well, I should say that because one of the main reasons why I started my pod is that, I mean, I was, since Michael Brooks kind of passed away, Michael Brooks was kind of had overlapping communities very much in terms of having people on, in terms of his pod, in terms of obviously the socialist, Marxist sort of people that are out there, but also he had Zizek on his pod multiple times. And what he was doing as well is weaving in integral theory. And what I see in your work is that you're weaving in all these particular dimensions into your work. I mean, the whole systems theories type approach, along with the sort of evolutionary type worldview, but with a real focus as well on the idea of, or the complexity of the subject, and the need for psychoanalysis to go out and really understand what's going on the, what we would actually go out and refer to, I guess, in an integral theory in terms of the upper left quadrant, or specifically, the area specialized on the subject. So I guess I want to ask you a bit in terms of, I guess, your audience that you're cultivating through your online work. And obviously you seem to be thriving, and you seem to be really excited in terms of people that are coming into your community, and they're coming from all these various disparate traditions and philosophical backgrounds. I guess, what do you make about what's kind of going on in this historical moment right now in terms of all these communities that are kind of, coalescing and are really excited about philosophy, German idealism, and stuff like that? I was kind of curious to get, some of your ideas of what do you think is going on in this historical moment around some of this stuff?
You know what? It's a fantastic question. That's why I smiled, because it's something that I'm aware of. It's on the edge of my consciousness, but I don't really put a label on what I see emerging. I don't name it, but I do see what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
There are, and here's the thing I'll start with. This is where I'm at. I do have a certain fidelity to what I would see in philosophy as a type of Zizekian event. However, I'm also aware that any type of mono theory, or any type of singular adherence to either one thinker or one group of thought, is a dead end, and I don't want to go and sort of lose myself in just that area. I want to constantly, and I think that's true to like sort of the history of my thinking, is I constantly want to keep abreast and aware of adjacent communities, bring people in, find unusual connections, bring in diversities of discourses in a way that is not sort of losing contact with a singular drive. I don't just want to, there are containers, there are boundaries in my work. Like there are places where I don't go. There are places where I'm trying to look and trying to search for new connections. But ultimately, I mean, what I'm trying to do is a type of philosophical a type of philosophical revival in some sense, like a return to fundamental text, a return to deep reading of thinkers, a staying away from straw man arguments, staying away from simplistic reductions of enormous titans of thought, cultivating a community of readers who are actually reading and reading each other, um, and just trying to kind of steward or garden uh, other minds as well as they come into philosophy. And so in some sense, I feel like what I'm doing also is I'm interested in not in just specific philosophers, but what does it mean to become a philosopher yourself? And not just yourself, but with others in a community. And so I think the results of that will be a much richer discourse for the complexity that I think is signaled by communities like, for example, the integral space, like the Stoa, like everything that you were mentioning about what's going on in Toronto with the work of Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke and all of that work. I think that all of that work is necessary. All of that work is extremely important. But I think it also represents a symptom that we need more philosophical cognition, meaning we need more people who have had long-term engagement with philosophy. And we need people who are capable of really embodying that process, both on the level of teachers, on the level of collaborators, and on the level of students.
Gotcha. Okay. No, no, for sure. Well, I mean, because I obviously reading the global brain singularity, and I mean the book on subjects and systems. I mean, to me, I mean, you're really bringing a new dimension, particularly to, I mean, I guess the sublation sort of zero books crew in terms of, you know, people like Daniel and stuff like that. That they're obviously Zizekins are very much more into the sort of Marxist sort of philosophy around Zizek and stuff like that. But you're just bringing in a dimension that speaks to me from my background, I guess, in integral theory. So I'm just excited to go and see that dimension kind of being played into this larger sort of context. But I guess, do you have any familiarity, I guess, in terms of the with the integral theory and the background and the history of that particular movement? I was curious to know.
Yes, so I do in a sense. So like this is the distinction I would make, is that there are certain communities and certain fields of thought where I feel like I'm an insider.
Okay.
And the reason why I feel like I'm an insider is because I inhabited those discourses. I wore those identities in a sense. Like, for example, when I was an evolutionary theorist, I would identify as an evolutionary theorist or a systems theorist or I don't know, or a Zizekian. But I've read Ken Wilber. I've
Oh, okay.
interacted with a lot of I've interacted with a lot of people in integral spaces. I've actually been to a few conferences where there's a big integral presence.
Oh, no way. Okay,
Probably
cool.
the
Okay.
probably the conferences where I had the most contact with integral thinkers was when I was in the big history community. There
Okay.
was a period when I was with the big history community where there was a lot of integral thinkers, and I would talk to a lot of people in that field. But I don't consider myself an insider. But it's at the same time a community that is always on the periphery of my interactions, whether that's Layman Pascal, whether that's other things I see, like related to the work of metamodernists,
Mhm.
Daniel Gertz, for example. Um, so it's clearly a field which has a lot to say, and I know there's a lot of I basically study what I see as the discursive antagonisms internal to that field. So like there seems to be a lot of antagonisms between integral theorists and metamodernists, and people who think in terms of stage theory, and people who think that's too reductive or think that's too restrictive, to multiplicity or plurality. So I keep my eye on it, and I'm certainly open to networking with people in that community.
Yeah. No, no. I mean, and that's exactly what I get from, your work, and particularly your online presence. I mean, obviously your work is very well grounded in the systems theory, and your anthropological sort of background and connection to big history really comes through in your written work. But I'm fascinated, I guess, between some of your written work and what's kind of going on with you online. And obviously, now that you've launched the philosophy portal, and I mean, you're just interacting with a lot of interesting, particular people out there. And so I guess, so you consider yourself, obviously, since you're more of a Zizekian, or you like that particular philosophy, or you've been really attracted to Zizek's body of work. How do you relate, I guess, between the Hegelian and the sort of Marxist sort of branch within the Zizek sort of? Because this was a question that I asked to Matt Flisfetter, because he was trying to go out and articulate a form of new humanism. And obviously, I mean, he's deeply inspired by Zizek, yet he feels that Zizek is kind of going off a bit the deep end in terms of moving towards communism instead of re-articulating some form of new humanism. So I was kind of curious to see or hear a bit more in terms of how you relate to the Hegelian Marxist dimension to Zizek's work a bit more.
Yeah, it's again a great question. And I really see that this is at the heart of the Zizekian project, which is basically accepting that something was rotten in the core of Marxism, and it's in some sense, it's similar to what Lacan's doing, a return to Freud. In some sense, what Zizek's doing is a return to Hegel from like the common sort of narrative. And I read a lot about this in my doctorate. Was Marx turned Hegel on his head. Marx as the materialist turned Hegel, the idealist, on his head, made it practical, brought in the political economic dimension, and that made Hegel's ideas actual as opposed to just ideal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Zizek's return to Hegel is like, no, wait a second, let's go back to the original Hegelian texts. Let's see the way, or let's basically, I think Zizek's assuming the way in which Hegel's work has been the source of repetitive misinterpretations from Kierkegaard, from Marx, up to figures like Deleuze and others. And let's see if we can, let's say, go back to the drawing board of political economic systems from the starting point of Hegel, in some sense, with the dialectical thought trick of what would Hegel say to Marx. And I think this is a general trick in philosophy that can be extracted and applied more generally, is that we all know the common narrative of philosophy because, of course, Marx was alive and Hegel didn't have a chance to respond to Marx because Hegel was dead. Right. So there's always a series of negations in philosophy where the person who died never gets a chance to respond to the person who's negating them. And so what Zizek's doing in some sense is playing that role of flipping conventional narratives and playing with the idea, how would Hegel read Marx? Right. And we could also do that with other philosophers, right? Like, for example, how would Plato read Aristotle? Right, like this, that's another, you can do this with many different thinkers that have a little historical antagonism. And I think that where that leads Zizek is, and I think this is very precise, is I think that's what leads Zizek actually beyond positivist humanism. So he would say that Marxism is too positivist, Marxism is too humanist, and in some sense, it proposes a too simplistic reconciliation of subject and substance, or in my language, from systems and subjects. And I talk about this in Systems and Subjects, a too simplistic solution to the problem of systems and subjects. Mm-hmm. That there's a deeper antagonism at the core of systems and subjects, or systems and substance, which we need to think. And Hegel here is a good thinker to bring with us because he thinks absolute negativity. He thinks the negativity at the core of systems and subjects, which Marx tries to close up. And now, what is the practical result of that doctrine, or what is the practical result of that approach? And I think that comes out in Zizek's later works, especially the works inspired by COVID-19, which is a form of disaster communism. And what disaster communism is basically an inversion of utopianized communism. We should not think of communism as a positive ideal in which humans will find their, work relations and their relations with each other in some sort of harmonious or some sort of qualitatively different positive order. But rather, we should see the possibilities of communism only in relationship to imminent global antagonisms, right? So, like when we have something like COVID-19, well, that is a necessity for states to coordinate. That is a necessity for states to, in some sense, approach a common horizon. But that common horizon will not be established by a positive force, but by a negative force like COVID-19. Or you could imagine throughout the 21st century, some other global antagonisms emerging because we're so interconnected. And I guess that's the real thing, is because we're so interconnected now globally, where something in Wuhan can affect someone in Hamilton, and where something on, basically anywhere on the planet can have a cascading failures, to use the language from system science, is that these cascading failures, I would say, are the motive or the place from which we could interpret a new political economic order, which would be able to address problems that I label as the commons gap, which is the gap between our present situation and problems which require, as a necessity, global coordination. Global warming is an example, for example, of a very complex web of interrelated ecological catastrophes, which, if the projections are correct, which we don't know, of course, but if the projections are correct of what could happen because of effects of global warming in between now and 2100, we are going to have situations appear which require a higher order of coordination. And I think that's where Zizek would ask us to think. So it's in some sense, it's not a new humanism, but in Zizek's own language, I think what he points towards is the inhuman dimension of negativity. So let me give a specific example again. The inhuman dimension of negativity. Well, what was COVID-19 but an inhuman negativity? It was not human. It was a virus. It was microscopic. We can't see it, but it affects all humans negatively. So this type of thinking, I think, is where my mind points.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, I mean, and I mean, because you're adopting a whole new language as well. I mean, you're adopting the idea of a meta horizon or meta science to go out and describe some of that as well. I mean, and I guess in terms of some of the stuff, in terms of meta-modernity, it is very close to the integral community in various ways. And I was kind of curious to hear you kind of flesh out a bit what you mean by meta-horizon and a new sort of meta-science, or trying to develop a meta-science to go out and try and, I guess, sublimate and try and make sense of what we're experiencing and what is arising and what is emerging and stuff like that. Because that's completely different than what Matt Flisfetter is talking in terms of a new humanism, and even Zizek, right? I mean, Zizek is talking about communism, but yet you're talking about a new form of science or a meta horizon or new. Well, I mean, I even had a bit of a title actually for our talk today. I'll throw it out there at you because this is kind of how I organize my thoughts in terms of when I approach some of these interviews, is towards a new philosophical horizons. I mean, we're moving towards new philosophical horizons, and we're trying to go out and make sense of it and sublimate it and try and objectify it so we can actually go out and coordinate better in a certain way. But I was curious to hear you kind of flesh out what you mean by meta horizon and meta science and what you're thinking there a bit in the back of your mind as you've been working on all this for so many years.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I mean, I agree with. I mean, I think that the title towards a new philosophical horizon, that makes sense. I do think the role of sublimation and thinking about objectivity from the point of view of mechanisms like sublation and sublimation are, it's throughout systems and subjects. And then the concept of the meta horizon and meta science, to me, the meta horizon to me is almost a philosophico-political concept.
Mm-hmm.
So philosophical political meaning, and I use sort of Nietzsche here to play around with the idea of the death of God being sort of the death of the big other, or the death of a horizon. meaning a death of a common horizon which unifies everyone. So, for example, Christianity or even nation state concepts like the United States. These are concepts which I think had a major structuring role, of course, in 19th and 20th century society. But the meta horizon is kind of the paying attention more to the antagonism between different entities which are trying to dominate the entire space. Like it's more like the emergence of a multipolar world, right? I think this comes up in Peter Sloterdijk's work as well. You know, with going from spheres to bubbles to foams, where basically we're moving away from, let's say, United States as the world police or the United States as the nation state, which is the sort of objective center of political economic activity, to a situation where you have many different competing models of what the political horizon actually is. So this to me is a challenge to the neoliberal hegemony that has been enforced since the Cold War, right? So we have the emergence of different models. The Chinese model is not the same as the American model, right? I think the European, we see the tensions with European Union and Russia as a competition of totally different visions of what the future is, right? And then we're not even bringing in yet actors like India, or what about the future of Brazil or South America or even Africa, right? When we bring in all of those actors, and I think in the 21st century, all of those regions will become major actors on the global stage. We're talking about a competition of paradigms. An example here would be competition of ideological infiltration in Africa between, for example, mimicking a model of Western democracy versus adopting more of a Chinese model where you're privileging certain practical economic organization dimensions over democracy, right? So these types of conflicts, I think, is where I point towards with the meta horizon. Is we need to think about not just one sort of dominant power, or not even one sort of global communist harmony. Certainly not. That doesn't seem to be the way it looks at all. It's much more a competition between an antagonistic political field, which is going to be increasingly confronting its own self-reflection when, let's say, metaphorically, the shit hits the fan, like, for example, a global catastrophe like COVID-19 hits, where those models do have practical ramifications on how we, for example, organize ourselves in relationship to those existential threats. And then a meta science would be basically a science which radically includes the subject, right? So it's I would say that, to me, I'm quite comfortable with it being a movement from a classical objective materialism to a type of dialectical materialism. And I think the way Zizek uses dialectical materialism, to me, makes a lot of sense, in the sense that it's not that we just focus on ideas of sort of idealistic consciousness, but we're actually thinking about the material of subjectivity's being, right? Like we take seriously the materiality of our discourse, like what we're doing right now. To me, that's a movement towards a meta science.
Gotcha. No, and I guess what I appreciated about your framing it as a meta science, and you're weaving in obviously ideas of religion and politics and stuff like that, but you have a way throughout all of your writing and even your online presence. I mean, you're so not ideologically political, if I could say. Even your work that you did in terms of Zizek versus Peterson, right? I mean, which are extremely two polarizing figures, for the left and for the right. And your stance was, no, both please. You want both of them to go out and be at the table, which I thought was ingenious in terms of how you went out and frame it, because there is this tribalness to what's kind of being politically anyways, playing into the narratives now. And what I really appreciate about your perspective or your ability is to actually go and take literally a more sort of standoffish political science and real scientific worldview to actually go and make sense of all of this phenomenon without falling into ideological traps and politicizing things. So I was kind of, because I see a lot of great things that Peterson has also done, but I also see some, I mean, obviously crazy dimensions that he's actually gone out and moving towards. And I kind of feel the same way about in terms of the Zizek left on some levels. I'm from Quebec. I'm French Canadian, so I'm even more alienated, I guess, from American politics in a certain way in terms of, where I come from a particular background. And my formal studies is actually in religious studies. So I guess my question is, I mean, what, well, I guess you when I emailed you, you kind of wanted to shy away a bit from the Zizek Peterson type stuff that you've written. Or
we can discuss it. No.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I didn't want to pressure you about that, but I mean, where do you see that kind of following into what's happening now, in terms of I guess in terms of what's going on in the sort of zeitgeist of the internet, and even some of the tribes that we've been talking about, the so-called philosophical orientations or movements or sociological sort of schools that we're seeing popping up all over online and stuff like that. What are your thoughts a bit on that? And even some of your thoughts now, that you've got that Zizek Peterson stuff out of your system and stuff like that.
Well, yeah. So I mean that the Zizek and Peterson both pleas was written, of course, quite a few years ago, and it was written with the hope of encouraging debate. It was written with the hope. This was written before the actual Zizek and Peterson debate occurred, and I was part of a number of other people who were clamoring for that meeting to occur.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm happy that it did occur. Now, I think that debate sort of revealed something very specific, which to me was the importance of philosophy, because it was very clear to me that Peterson, however intelligent, articulate, and helpful that he is on the plane of psychology, he hasn't studied philosophy in anywhere near the depth that Zizek has studied philosophy. And so in some sense, I feel like Peterson, and all respect to Peterson, because he influenced me a lot, especially in his early lectures of the Maps of Meaning, which I found incredibly helpful, especially for where I was as a man at that time. His work helped me a lot. However, as he's become more successful, I think that what happens a lot of the times when people in a specific discipline become very successful, whether that's they're specialized in psychology, whether they're specialized in neuroscience, whether they're specialized in literature, what happens is that you get thrown into the everything and you don't have a philosophical background to deal with the everything. So I think that transition from a narrow specialized discipline, even with someone like Peterson, who's exceptionally well read and obviously an interdisciplinary thinker, but
and
again,
almost an evolutionary type thinker. I mean, obviously his influence in terms of, in terms of,
no, I think,
yeah.
Well, I think that I think one of Peterson's great benefits to our thinking and to the moment in which he was emerging was precisely to make contradictory this relationship between evolutionary thinking and religious thinking, that there was too much of a divide between evolutionary and religious thinking, which I think Peterson was the perfect person to complexify and contradictify, I think, and I think that came out, like, I think the difference between a Peterson and the new atheists, right? Like, that's like, Peterson is a difference from the new atheists, which I think our culture was clamoring for.
Oh, totally. And such a stark contrast between Peterson and the new atheist movement and stuff, for sure.
But that came out he had debates with Sam Harris, and that blew up. He even had a debate with Richard Dawkins, which was a little more embarrassing, but at the same time, it strikes at an interesting tension point, which I think does require thinking about why that tension exists the way that it does. Now Zizek, behind closed doors, and in more of his circles, would say that, look, the problem with Peterson is more in the leftist reaction to Peterson, which is what I saw. And so, for example, Zizek would ask questions like, we have to ask ourselves, why did someone like Peterson become so mega popular? Right? Like, whereas leftists were just reacting to him in such a childish way as to create a straw man of each other. And I think that's what, and I think to Peterson's discredit, like, I think that's where, to me, he made a mistake, was by taking these leftist provocations too seriously,
Mm.
by creating straw men of each other. He just got caught up in the culture war, which he was supposed to be addressing and relieving. And I think that he's gone further and further, in my view, in increasing the tensions of the culture war. Whenever he's asked about leftist politics, and that's like, for example, he resists any debate. He creates straw man of the left, and even to the point where, when one of the greatest anthropologists and Marxist theorists, David Harvey, invited him into a class to learn about basic Marxism, he basically reacted in a totally ideological way. So this is to me a deep problem. And now, if you say, for example, the Zizek left could also get called into this, I resist a little bit, because, and here's the reason why, is that some of my friends just recently interviewed Zizek about his association with a magazine called Compact Magazine,
Mm-hmm.
which is not a leftist woke magazine. But he says that it's the only magazine left that will publish him, that he is increasingly being censored by the woke left, that he has no more outlets left to publish. Right. Like, I actually went to a lecture that he did at Birkbeck University, where he was trying to offer some sort of helpful solution to the ideological traps of woke politics. And he was basically booed out of the room in some sense.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a way in which I think Zizek is constantly bouncing around in this ideological nightmare, trying to find the few spots left where there's real thinking. And I think that where he's finding himself is increasingly in webs where I'm located. Right.
Yeah.
Because I think that so, like, for example, we were just recently published together in a Sublation magazine article, and we were just recently published together in an underground theory anthology by David McCarricker of Theory Underground. And these outlets are underground theory. These outlets are some subaltern alternative to the dominant political ideologies of, for example, the Daily Wire on the one hand, or the woke left on the other hand.
Totally. No, for sure. And beautifully said as well. I mean, this has been my attraction as well to your work and some of the stuff that you've been doing. And I mean, this is why I also got attracted to what Michael Brooks was doing. I mean, Michael Brooks kind of identified, or started to refer to as Peterson as the new right, or what Matt McManus might go out and call postmodern conservatism, as a sort of reactionary type movement that arose, that, you know, the conditions were particularly ripe for some sort of reactionary sort of backlash against the postmodern left or woke left and stuff like that. And now that, you know, we're sort of stuck in some sort of ideological war between these two camps, but there's plenty of there's like a multiplicity of other groups that are kind of looking around and saying to themselves, you know, how can we actually go and move beyond this? So this is where, I mean, I got attracted to Jeremy Johnson's work, particularly, and some of the other guys, and even Layman Pascal as well. They started playing around or toying with the idea of a sort of an integral left, or I like to actually go out and refer to as the next left. Is that something new needs to actually go out and emerge for us to go out and sort of transcend and include, you know, what we're currently seeing in terms of, I guess, the culture wars now, right now, and stuff like that. And there's a few people. That's why I got excited about Daniel Tutt's work, and I'm very excited about Matt Flisfetter's work in terms of what he's trying to go out and do as well. He seems to be trying to articulate some sort of new humanism that might be able to go out and address what's going on, or people are trying to go out and come up with something new that might be able to go out and emerge out of that. And your work, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar at all with Adrian Johnson's work. You are, yeah. Okay, sweet. Yeah, because I see your work very much in sort of parallel with him, since he uses a.
Yes. That
Uh,
that that is a very high compliment to me because I'm a big fan of Adrian Johnston's work. But I'll let you finish.
yeah, well, I mean, because even well, I was curious about Matt Flisfetter's work and whether he was actually going out and sort of thinking along those directions. And he said the same thing. He said, yeah, he's a big admirer of Adrian's work, and he kind of aspires as well to go out and sort of fall into that kind of line, that sort of deep scholarship that we might actually go out and need. But so how do you actually see your work kind of in parallel with Adrian's work, or how do you see it kind of overlapping or moving in that direction in a particular way?
Well, I see Adrian as somewhat of a leader, and maybe one of the first really serious scholars to take the Zizekian moment of philosophy seriously.
Okay.
Like, I don't think there's too many. I don't think there's too many people who dedicated their lives to philosophy, have spent their entire careers as a philosopher, were existing in parallel with Zizek as a thinker, and recognizing simultaneously, oh, Zizek has stumbled upon something here. He's stumbled upon something which allows us to escape the postmodern deconstructive turn. He's found something which allows us to get out of the horizons of discursive historicism, of relativism, in such a way as it gives us sort of a robust new philosophical horizon to think through dialectics and structuralism again and apply them to the current moment. And I think that in particular, Johnston's work is the first major attempt to, as it were, integrate, if you want to use the integral language, the results of Zizek's repetition. And I think that where he's coming out on that is basically the importance of the unity between Hegelian negativity and the Freudian death drive. So if any politics is going to emerge, I would interpret from Johnston's work, it would have to include a politics of negativity as opposed to the old positivist notions of human relations. And it would have to include a notion of death drive as opposed to a liberalist ego concept. Right. So until we bring those two things together, on the one hand, the Hegelian negativity needs to be built into our logic, and the death drive has to be built into our concept of self or our concept of ego. And I think that those two things are precisely what could explode the coordinates of, on the one hand, the woke left, and on the other hand, a conservative reactionary motion. Which I don't think either of these fields, broadly speaking, would understand what's really going on here in terms of logic and in terms of psychology, existentialism.
Yeah. And that's the interesting thing too about Adrian's work is that, well, I mean, he's gravitated more towards psychology compared to Zizek in a particular way. His orientation is much more, I guess, towards the social sciences and psychology, and very much in terms of a sort more evolutionary type thinking, the way you are. And Zizek, if I understand correctly, is kind of well, even Matt Flisfetter said that he kind of dives off the end in terms of the hard sciences, in terms of physics and stuff like that, which they think it's a bit of a mistake for him gravitating in that direction. And I mean, due to your sort of more hard nosed sort of science background, how do you? Well, yeah, I guess how do you view Zizek from a sort of more scientific lens? How do you view, or even just your evolutionary understanding versus his more dialectical type thinking? Right, is in pretty hard nosed contradiction, or even in terms of a contrast there. So I'd be curious to hear a bit more about how you see that, or how you're making sense of those two disparate sort of disciplines or understandings of philosophy and that type of stuff.
Yeah, that really gets to the heart of the issue, doesn't it? So let's start a little bit with the difference between the dialectical and the evolutionary form of thinking. Is that here I think what we've missed, and I think that, you know, for me, if integral thinking could be used in a very interesting way, I would say to highlight this issue could be an interesting place for future integral research, would be the conversation which was never had between Hegel and Darwin. And
Yeah.
when I say Hegel and Darwin, I'm talking about the traditions that stem from Hegel and Darwin. I'm talking about the Darwinian tradition, which goes into neo-Darwinian evolution and goes into emergentist evolutionary thinking. And then on the dialectical thinking, the history of Hegelo-Marxism and the political economic projects that came from that tradition, right? And how do these ways of thinking talk to each other? Because it seems like, on the one hand, there is a point of connection, precisely because even Darwin and Marx had communication with each other, and Marx even wanted Darwin to write a review or a recommendation of his work. But this connection seems to me to be have gone lost. Now, the evolutionary side of things obviously focuses and starts with its emphasis on the evolution of biological organisms, whereas the Hegelian side of thing in dialectical thinking is focusing on thinking as such. So then that brings up the question: what is the relationship between thinking as such and the organism?
Okay. Yeah.
Right, and the history of our organism, understood in evolutionary terms, both on the level of genetics and on the level of the organism and on the level of the superorganism, if you want to use the more emergentist concepts, and the way our thought basically functions. So to me, that's an open conversation. And I think that this is work which probably Zizek could have done a bit more, but he hasn't focused his energy at specifically this location, which means this is an open field for investigation, in my view.
Gotcha.
Now,
Yeah.
on the side of the physics, Zizek says explicitly in a chapter in Less Than Nothing, where he talks about the ontology of quantum physics, that a philosopher, and he's inspired by Badiou, he says a philosopher should take a real risk. A philosopher should take a real risk and make a mistake and risk a real mistake. And so he's chosen to make his risk and take his stance on quantum physics precisely because this is a field where traditionally continental philosophers have not had much to say. And so he's taking a risk there. And I would encourage people to even check out some of his recent talks where he's had a long form conversation with Sean Carroll on physics. And I come out of that conversation with the perspective that Zizek is sensing into something which needs to be sensed into. And even in Systems and Subjects, in the fourth part of Systems and Subjects, I emphasize also that what's at stake with the conversation between system science and continental philosophy should have something meaningful to say about quantum gravity. Like, and this is my basic position on quantum gravity. It can't be, if the field of physics has been tarrying with quantum gravity for almost a century, more than a century, and with the greatest minds being thrown at the problem, and it's still not being resolved, it can't be an issue of intelligence. It has to be an issue of philosophical framing, that the way we're thinking about quantum gravity is wrong. And so for me, that's the zero level where philosophy can help. It can't help with the technical descriptions. That's not philosophy's job. That's physics' job. But philosophy can help with reframing the problem, reframing the situation. And I have a paper in Global Brain Singularity towards the end where I talk about the need to include the subject in the system of thinking of physics, and thinking about the communities, the social historical communities of physics as such, as a part of the problem of quantum gravity. And here I rest on the work of Lee Smolin. So in the work of Lee Smolin, he basically gives the example where you'll have one community of string theorists and another community of loop quantum gravity theorists at the same conference, and they don't cross over. They just stay in, it's a problem of polarization. So you have a problem of polarization in the communities of physics themselves, which prevent. Now, there's part of the problem is also just a brute fact experimental problem, is that we don't have the technology to test at the level at which we need to test in order to resolve these issues. But there's also an issue of framing, and also an issue of the way we're thinking about this. And I think that's where Zizek's work might end up being historically relevant.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I mean, I'll be blunt. I mean, the reason why I've had a tough time with Zizek or coming around to Zizek is because I've been so influenced by Habermas. And I feel Habermas really kind of speaks a bit more in terms of that tension between the sort of evolutionary worldview and the tensions between Marxism and the old Frankfurt sort of school and stuff like that. And I mean, he builds on Piaget, and he builds on the, whole bunch of other system type thinkers, and, the broad sweep of the social sciences, along with moral psychology and political science and stuff like that. So it's just every time I see this kind of continual return to Hegel, and I'm like, yeah, but there's Habermas. So like, I don't get it. Like, why is everybody like? But from a psychoanalytic and sort of Lacanian sort of, because I can't think of Zizek without his sort of Lacanian sort of take on things as well, right? And that's an area that I find that obviously Habermas doesn't really elaborate very much in terms of his body of work. It's there in a certain sense within the Frankfurt School, but it's not as as developed and as fully fleshed out the way he does. And well, I guess. And I agree with you in terms of that, how integral theory could actually go out and play into how to go out and fill in that particular gap. I mean, because integral theory has got a very interesting history as well, and it grew out in a certain way. Depending if you follow Zach Stein, and he wrote a particular paper in an ontology along with Bruce Alderman, that essentially he argues that integral theory is an outgrowth of pragmatism, particularly American pragmatism. And this is something that I took up a bit with Daniel Tutt, is that I was very curious about some of the writings he had done in terms of the tension between Marxism and American pragmatism to go and be fleshed out. So I guess I'll throw that out to you. I mean, what do you think of the pragmatist sort of tradition? Has it had any impact on you as a school of thought? In the background, or at any point in terms of your studies and stuff like that?
I'll say there are a few thinkers who I haven't read nearly as much as I should, and are on my list of next big thinkers to tackle.
Okay.
I would say at the top of that list is probably Charles Sanders Peirce.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
In terms of the history of the pragmatist school, and semiotics. And of course, I think probably but maybe the viewers don't know, that Charles Sanders Peirce was hugely influenced by St. Louis Hegelians. That there was a major American school of Hegelianism,
totally, yeah.
In St. Louis, and he was a product of that school. So I think and I've heard many people say that Charles Sanders Peirce is almost like the American Hegel. So in some sense, I think that connection is another one where I would say that's a lines yet to be drawn in the sand, so to speak.
Cool. All very cool stuff. Yeah, no, and I mean, there's kind of almost a sort of Canadian idealism tradition as well that permeated through Charles Taylor as well up in Canada. There was a bit in contrast. But I guess because another huge thinker that had an impact on me along with Habermas is Richard J. Bernstein. I'm just a huge fan of his work. And I think he's even better than Habermas. I mean, actually, he's the best guide that I had to actually going out and studying Habermas, and it was just so helpful for me to go out and make sense of him when my professors were kind of slamming that down my my throat and over my head. Cool. I mean, we're getting pretty much to the end of the sort of questions that I had here going for you. I mean, obviously, I would love to have you back on and even flesh out some of this other stuff here. But I'm curious to know kind of, what do you have in the pipeline, and what are you working on now? I mean, since you've, I mean, what's exciting you, and what do you think is your next project you want to actually go out and dive into?
Man, I'm in such a interesting and weird space. And also, it's been a pleasure to be on here. I think your questions have been great, and I think you're holding a lot of very interesting perspectives here where your voice is necessary. So I appreciate these questions enormously. In terms of the pipeline, well, I just started Lacanzi Cree course, so I'm like knee deep in the middle of this thing, trying to teach this thing. And what I've been trying to set up with Philosophy Portal is not only this return to foundational texts and taking the time to go through them in the detail they deserve, but also trying to point towards both the students' creativity in relationship to these. So there'll be a conference, there'll be an anthology related to that. There'll also be an anthology related to the Science of Logic course. And I've got a few ideas about what directions to go. I've got like 3 or 4 different like potential manuscripts that are pulling my attention in terms of what will come out next. There's a manuscript of a lot of my dialectical thinking at the end of Global Brain Singularity, which I want to rewrite and reframe. So I'm trying to work on that. I also want to turn all of the courses I've done into books.
Yeah, I can
So
imagine. Yeah.
I'm playing around with the idea of writing books for for Science of Logic. I'm playing around with the idea of writing a book for the Acree. I would even like to get around to writing books for Phenomenology of Spirit and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So anything in that direction is something there will come out in 2024. Just what that looks like is still in the seed phases.
Gotcha. Okay. I mean, and I should be honest as well. I mean, the books that I really kind of dove into and really kind of sunk my teeth in, it was the systems and subjects and your global brain singularity book. And I know, I mean, obviously, I watched some of the interviews that you did in terms of the abysmal arrows and spiritual leadership stuff, but I haven't actually got around to actually going out and reading that particular book. So that could be, a fun thing for me to circle back around to have you back on and sort of unpack a bit of that. But I was really just interested in terms of your systems and subjects based approach and how that's playing into your larger thinking around continental philosophy and stuff like that. And I mean, we didn't even really touch on the stuff around the spiritual leadership or even religion. And I know you have deep interest along with that too. I mean, maybe we can kind of end a bit on that as well. I'd be curious to, I guess, Peterson's approach to religion and Zizek's ideas of religion are very different as well. And I mean, I've been seeing you kind of gravitate towards some interesting thinkers, Peter Rollins in particular, and I'm a big admirer of his work as well. In terms of what he's doing, I think it's very innovative and it's in complete contrast to what kind of Peterson is doing, but it's also building very deeply, obviously, on Zizek. So I'd be curious to kind of see, where do you, because I see you moving very much in that direction as well. So I'm kind of curious to see, what are your thoughts on that, and if you see some deep collaboration there kind of happen for you on those lines as well, moving into the future too.
Absolutely. So Peter Rollins has been probably one of the most interesting connections that I've developed this year. I reached out to him last winter, and he actually had been aware of my work from doing Zizek's Less Than Nothing series way back when I started on YouTube. And of course, I followed him on his channel for some time. I think that Peter Rollins is very interesting because he's very much, how I was talking about the inside and the outside of certain discourses. Mm-hmm. Rollins is very much inside theology.
Yeah.
He's very much inside the religious sphere. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that he inhabits those discourses. He moves in circles where there are people related to different religious organizations. And he plays a really important function there, which is creating a bridge between the philosophical discourses in the Zizekian sphere and, I would say, what is going on in contemporary Christianity, certain aspects of current contemporary Christianity, where there seems to need to be a bridge between ideas of salvation or grace which include within them lack, or include within them alienation, or include even within them a relationship to the death of God theology. So I think Rollins is pushing in that direction. His concepts like the pyrotheology and the Church of the Contradiction are things that I very much resonate with. And we do have tentative ideas for collaboration in 2024, but right now the concrete collaboration is that he's teaching in the Acree course. So he'll be teaching pyrotheology and Church of the Contradiction in the Acree course, and whatever comes out of that, we'll see what goes on in 2024. But I see that as a very positive and a very necessary direction.
Yeah, very cool. No, and I mean, a lot of the, I mean, because I spent a lot of time studying sort of postmodern theology, and he's really kind of pushing the envelope in terms of where theology is at. And I'd love to hear his thoughts on Milbank and the whole Zizek debate and that type of stuff. And it really is high form theology along with a deep philosophy that he's doing, which is really, really cool. And it's interesting to me as well to go and see that as a bit of a parallel to your sort of project as well, in terms of how that's playing into, your book in terms of spiritual leadership and what does that actually go out and mean. But I'd be curious. I mean, what's your relationship to Christianity? I mean, do you have any, or even religious sort of your religious worldview? I mean, I know you kind of grew up, I think, in a sort of secular household, if I'm not mistaken. But have you dabbled in the sort of theological realm, or do you consider yourself to be kind of a practicing sort of? A lot of people within the integral community, are practicing Buddhists. There's a whole Christian dimension in some forms of the integral community. But I was kind of curious to hear you kind of maybe flesh that out a bit before we end. I'd be curious to hear your relationship to religion in a certain way.
Yeah, I think the easiest. So yeah, my background's secular. My dad was an atheist. Before he died, he gave me a book on Zen Buddhism.
Oh, okay, cool.
So I take that as an interesting message from him. My mother's agnostic, maybe a little spiritual or something like that. But I was raised in a very secular home, and it was a very open home. So I didn't, of course, as a kid, I would question God, but it was always very much just, almost just a childish speculation. I came into my intellectual development in the antagonism between evolutionary thinking and intelligent design.
Yeah.
And I would take the side of the evolutionary thinking, of course, and was developing that. However, I would say in contact with heartbreak, in contact with loss, in contact with a fundamental lack, I did start to develop a deep appreciation for both the signifiers of Buddha and Christ. I lean more towards the symbol of Christ because of the level of historical symbolic engagement with violence that I think is necessary to confront inside oneself in relationship to the social body. And I do find myself quite sympathetic with the project of Christian atheism. However, my main structural mode of interpreting is informed by the phenomenology of spirit by Hegel. And what I pay attention to there is the distinction between the chapter on religion and the chapter on absolute knowing.
Cool.
And
yep.
and the chapter on absolute knowing brings one to a point of view which Hegel would call spirit science. And if I was to identify, I would say I'm somewhere in between Christian atheism and spirit science.
Very cool. Yeah. No. I mean, and I had a bit of an intuition in terms of where you were kind of leaning and stuff like that. But I mean, Zizek as well, I thought one of the main reasons why I haven't fully gravitated towards the Zizek canon of work and stuff like that is sort of his criticism of Buddhism. I thought he's ripped into Buddhism in some very astute ways, but on some other levels, I think that uh, he hasn't been that particularly fair. But and I mean, I understand he's a Westerner, so I mean, he's totally allowed to go out and be grounded within his own particular tradition as well, and orientation and worldview, which is an interesting dimension, I think, as well to his body of work. But having kind of grown up around the Integral movement, which was very deep into East Asian sort of philosophy and thinking, and that's primarily why I actually went into religious studies. But yeah, I'd actually love to have you back on and unpack some of those dimensions. I didn't think we would actually go out and have time to dig too deep into that, but I know you have deep interests around some of those subjects as well, so it could be fun to reconnect at some point or another. Well, great. I mean, listen, I really appreciate your time. And yeah, I'm definitely going to keep an eye out on all of your work. It's been a lot of fun following all of that. And you're doing some really cool stuff, man.
I'm massively appreciative of this. I think your questions are fantastic. I love the space of thought that you're holding. And I think you're zeroing in on some tension points, which can be very productive for future thinking. So I'm happy to connect anytime.
Super.